Variation according to the speaker. Now, what does that mean? Read it aloud in your head, in your mind, think what it could possibly mean. Okay. I can see bulbs lighting up. Died the top of the butt dead body. Died the top of the butt dead body? The speaker has changed all of the nasal vowels into their nearest non-nasal equivalent. Sorry, vowels, consonants, I mean. For example, died is from 9, but the N with a nose block changes to a D because the tongue is stuck on the back of the alveolar ridge, just like in an N, but there's no sound coming through the nose, so it turns into a D. So, if you analyse all of it, you notice the same process throughout. Every time there was going to be a nasal consonant, the nearest non-nasal equivalent came out. Therefore, speaker has a blocked nose. Elementary, my dear Watson. Let's do a forensic approach to accents here. Not strictly speaking accents in this case. But notice this, it's sometimes a little bit difficult when you first meet a speaker with a blocked nose to understand what they mean. At first, for a few seconds, milliseconds, and then you have a kind of switch in your brain, and it goes, the switch is up for normal, down for speaker has cold. Right? There's a setting in your brain. And so you put the setting on to, speaker has cold. And now, with that insight, everything suddenly becomes comprehensible. Right? You make a subconscious translation of those non-nasals back into nasals in your brain. This is a process known as accommodation. You take something which you're not expecting and accustom yourself to it. John Field uses the word to normalise to a speaker's voice. Every new speaker that you meet, who you haven't spoken to before, you need a few seconds, minutes, depending, to normalise to their voice quality, pitch, accent, etc. So you could call it normalisation as well. So that was a block nose called the temporary states. Now let's look at some slightly more permanent states. What's that? Rock and roll? Some people are saying rock and roll. Rock and roll. So, are you Brazilian?
No.
Right, it's a Brazilian speaker. In Rio de Janeiro, or Rio de Janeiro. Because in that specific way of speaking English, a lot of people pronounce R at the beginning exactly like an H. In French, it's a little bit in that direction, right? But in Brazilian, it's totally in that direction. It sounds exactly like an H. So, hock and hole. What happens here is then you hear this Brazilian speaker for a while. If you're not familiar with a Brazilian speaker, you might be a little bit, what's going on? To begin with. And then you normalise. And you go, okay, I get the picture. Every time I expect to hear an R, this guy's going to produce an H. And you adjust accordingly. This is accommodation. In this case, it's accommodation to an accent which isn't a native speaker accent. So it doesn't matter whether it's native or not. It's same process both ways. One last example. It may be that this person is Irish, it's possible. Could be Jamaican. Could be from any number of non-native accents as well. What's happened here is the have changed to t and d. So the speaker speaks a variety of English that doesn't have th. Elementary. Yeah, you make the adjustment in your brain. You have the switch. It goes speaker produces th, speaker doesn't produce th. You can sit down there and normalise to that speaker's voice. It's an interesting one, this, because according to Jennifer Jenkins, this th sound is pretty rare around the world.
No.
It's in Spanish. But generally speaking, it's fairly rare, and she suggests that it's not worth spending a lot of time forcing students to perfect it. What would be the argument for that? Well, I can say we can adjust and understand without it. So plenty of native speakers who don't use the th sound as well. So it's not as if your student would be doing something wrong if they didn't produce it. Interesting one there, for another reason as well, this th thing. It brings me on to another point. When you're talking about accent variation, you think, how on earth can I get my students into a position where they can understand all of the English accents in the world? And not only the native ones, also the non-native ones. Well, you give them experience of all those accents. Fine, but that's going to take a long time. You need to accelerate the experience a bit. So I'm looking at these sounds which tend to vary, and I'm thinking, there's a pattern here. Not all of them are equally vulnerable. The th is a vulnerable consonant. It's likely to change across different accents. It's vulnerable. It's inherently unstable. Other sounds are less unstable. Consonants, for example, in English, tend to be relatively stable. In Spanish, they're pretty unstable. But in English, they tend to be pretty stable. So they're fairly reliable, with some exceptions, which I'm going to point out next. Consonants are islands of reliability. Vowels, on the other hand, are a stream of variation. But there is hope. Some of them are more vulnerable than others. So we could cheat a little bit and say, let's look at the vulnerable ones only, and leave the rest to look after themselves. 5 vulnerable vowels. Number 1, had, bad, cat. That's vulnerable. For example, in New Zealand, that can migrate to something that's more like what I would say, like head, bed, hip. It's a complete phoneme shift from my perspective, from one phoneme to another. I'm restricting this discussion only to ones which cause a shift of an entire phoneme. Fast, laugh, dance. Any idea where that might vary?
In the south of England.
South of England, north of England would vary, so it could be fast, laugh, dance. I can hardly bring myself to say it that way. Walk, bought. Then you've got walk, bought. So maybe the difference there between American and British. And same with for. Hot, shot, not. Might be something more like hat, sharp, not. And finally, cold, slowly, go. In a lot of British accents, that might be cold, slowly, go. For example, in Middlesbrough or Scotland. So these are my 5 vulnerable vowels, and we can focus on these ones. And it doesn't really matter where the accent is, in fact. It's just the message to students is this. Expect these vowels to be a bit unstable. Don't expect to hear these always the same. And also, don't beat yourself up about getting them right yourself to a specific model, because listeners are likely to be a little bit more flexible in listening with respect to these vowels. And the consonants, well, you've got rare and reader. That R there in my accent at the end, the R at the end of those words is not audible as an R. It changes the vowel, but it's not audible as an R. Whereas in many accents, it is pronounced. Like rare, for example. Then you got here and hair. The might disappear. So you get ear, air. I say accents. It's not only a question of accents, it's also a question of whether you're speaking formally or informally. It might relate to social class as well, although it's a little bit nasty to say so. It's nicer to talk about regions, isn't it? It's more tidy to talk about regions, but let's be honest. You've got waiting and water, where an American might say wading in water, with the flipped T in the middle there. So that T is a vulnerable consonant. Number 4, think, well, 4 and 5 we've already discussed, the inherently unstable th sounds. So there you go. Tink, you get tink, or you get sink as well, counter in France. Sink, I think so.
I think.
There's lots of different ways of getting it wrong. But the good news is every way is right. Now, dividing it into vulnerable sounds this way is trying to make the task a bit more manageable, right? But you don't need to do all of these at once in your making your students aware lessons. You can do them one at a time. Now, what I wanted to do with this is a kind of awareness-raising task for the students to try to replicate the experience of normalizing to a voice in written form. It's a strange idea, but I really do think that changing the medium makes the point stronger. Let's see what you think. Can you understand that at all? Without looking at the key. There has been one sound that's been transformed throughout to another sound, and as a clue, it's vulnerable vowel 1. So what is the rule? What is the transformation here? The A to E. In other words, this is the limerick as spoken perhaps by somebody from New Zealand. I had a good friend called Pet, whose cat sat on the mat. Pet was said when her clumsy or dead, sat on the cat on the mat. The experience of reading that is something like the experience of hearing an accent. And you have to do the same process, which is normalize. Once you get the rule is every A becomes E, then you take that rule throughout. There's a few more in the handout as well. I will leave you to read those on their own, because I think the answers are there, but they all relate to one of the vulnerable sounds, one of the vulnerable consonants, or one of the vulnerable vowels. Now I want to move on to, we've been looking at detail there, right? Raising student awareness in a very detailed way.